And I made a fatal error and have the wrong photo up for Christina. So my dearest, sincerest apologies to Christina. That is not her photo. But, all right. We got our virtual production all-stars on the stage. So we have Paul Debevec, the Chief Research Officer of Eyeline Studios, powered by Netflix. I'm going to hand it over to you, Paul. Enjoy, everyone. Round of applause.
Okay. Welcome, everyone. All right. Well, thank you so much for that introduction. We do, in fact, have a all-star panel for virtual production. I'd like to go and start by introducing some of our friendly folks over here. Maybe we should try to do it in order. So I'll start to my right, which is Fred. Fred is the chief. Give it up for Fred. Okay.
Thank you.
Fred is the Chief Innovation Officer for Monolith Studios, a preeminent LED architect in the film and television industry with over 30 years of experience to consistently push the boundaries of design and technology in cinema, and has worked closely with several Oscar-winning directors and cinematographers on their award-winning films. Next up, we have Christina. Please refer to the actual item here for the appearance. And she is a partner in the Los Angeles-based production consulting firm Nextgen Production, consulting producer on virtual production projects, studios, and other vendors. She has worked at GoPro's original content division, and in 2017 moved into visual effects at Industrial Light and Magic, where she was in the technology department managing render comp and virtual production R&D teams. In 2019, went to work on ILM Stagecraft, as well as their facial capture, motion capture production. Give it up for Christina. We have Phil Geisler himself, principal and founder of Machina, that we've seen on so many of the most exciting virtual production projects that we've seen out there. He strives to push the boundaries of technology and design in the entertainment industry, focusing on in-camera visual effects, real-time mixed reality, and the future of filmmaking and live broadcast, often finding himself at the intersection of technological innovation and creativity. And Phil, I think you might have brought like a little video for us to look at.
Yeah, there's a reel. You guys can play it.
Is that possible, Kim, in the back to run that? Yay.
It was the most beautiful set I've ever shot on.
For a second, I really believed I was going in time space.
To see the actors see what they're looking at was pretty transformative.
Don't you agree?
One of the biggest assets was the use of LED screens.
Nice touch, by the way.
Great, glad you approve.
What kind of fish?
I didn't ask what kind of fish it was, I'm sorry.
This is a pretty good size space for pretty much any large feature production could come in here.
We have a ton of gear coming in today, and we're installing the LED ceiling.
We understand exactly what you need from a production point of view as opposed to a manufacturer. Tie all the products together, make sure they operate together on set. It will also help add the creative and technical knowledge that we have that those manufacturers might not have.
It allows them to start seeing experiences in the LED volume as soon as possible.
We're driving cars on a Mars tonight. We're blasting off to the stars tonight. We wanna go, go.
cut that off right there.
Apparently I said the long one. Sorry, guys.
That's a long one. Let's cut that off right there so we can keep introducing our panel. Thank you, Phil.
Thanks for entertaining
Awesome
me.
stuff.
All right.
Lots of great
What wasn't on that reel?
Lots of great virtual production use cases. Erick Geisler is the CTO of Global Objects, a recognized technology leader and two-time Emmy winner, serving with extensive expertise in innovative fields like neural radiance fields, generative AI, LiDAR scanning, and photogrammetry. And he spearheads the development of realistic digital environments, democratizing access to digital replicas of the world. Let's welcome Erick. And finally, at the end, we have Josh Kerekes, the head of virtual production for Pixomondo. He facilitates the design and construction of Pixo's virtual production stages, including 2 in Toronto and 2 in Vancouver, and leads the direction of virtual production innovation, working with technology partners to develop bespoke solutions, keeping Pixo ahead of the curve. He's also a virtual production supervisor, working directly on Star Trek Discovery Season 4 and Star Trek coming up, Strange New Worlds. I got to work with him a little bit on Netflix's series Avatar: The Last Airbender in production on the main Vancouver stage, the largest LED volume stage in the world. Was that verified by Guinness, Josh? Is that true?
That whole bio is actually a couple of years dated now.
Okay.
I think we lost the record, unfortunately.
Oh, goodness. Okay. At the time was the largest. And you have a slide or two to put up?
Yeah, I do, actually.
Okay. Let's see. Is it possible to put up? What do we got here?
Okay, I guess we're going to dive right into it.
Let's dive right in. This is going to be one of our. We were going to talk about color stuff at some point. It looks like you got some color stuff on here.
I do have some color stuff. Let me elaborate on what this color stuff is. So what we're looking at here is a new color calibration platform that Sony's developing. So Pixomondo, we were acquired by Sony last year. And this is some results. So on the left hand, you see, the patches on the left side are the intended color values of a 24 color checker. And then on the right is the actual, what the camera perceived, how the camera saw that from an LED screen. And then after calibration, you can see, well, it's nearly flawless. It's surprisingly good. It's about a 20-minute calibration process. And the idea is really to kind of democratize and make LED calibration possible. And I mean, Sony, having manufactured the Venice cameras, which is one of the more popular cinema cameras out there, that gives them kind of intimate insight as to the spectral sensitivities of the camera and allows them to do much more accurate calibration, effectively turn the camera into a spectrometer, resulting in very, very accurate results. 1 delta E is pretty darn good.
Very nice. Thanks for that. Thanks for that. Well, let's welcome Josh, everyone. Yay. All right. So I wanted to start off with just a first question. We have had a few years of heavy production use of virtual production technology led by a lot of the people here on the stage. What has been happening recently? What are some recent innovations that have helped address some of the things that take it even further that you've been working with? If there's something that you've been working on. Sounds like, Josh, you've been working on a color calibration technique. That's good. What other things have people been doing to try to push it beyond where we saw it used in the first few years?
Well, I can go. So one of the things that we've been looking at is obviously how to get truer colors, not only from the camera's point of view, but also truer color spectrums coming off of the panels themselves. So there was a great demonstration yesterday from Brompton about some of the things that they're doing, and some of those technologies are now to improve the color coming off of the wall and how it renders skin tones for the actors and stuff like that.
Very good. Great.
Yeah, I think it's a big one. I think also standardization, right? It's starting to look at how do we standardize formats? How do we deal with multiple parties wanting to collaborate in the same environment, right? Whether it's an Unreal scene or a Maya scene, whatever it ends up being, right? Or a bespoke render. How are we working together to share that language? And whether it's Material X and USD or something new, I think is a big open topic. But I think also standards around data packing and sharing the information with post, I think are sort of, for me, the next big steps in easing a lot of the trouble. I think I agree with certainly the work that Josh and Sony have done and Pixo on the color calibration is awesome. That's a big one. And then definitely getting to, I think, more spectral, broad emission from LED, and making sure that response is proper on skin tone in particular, I think is important. And I think making sure that we're doing that in a way that's ubiquitous across the field is super important. I know one of the things that we're also looking at is how do we make tools that are significantly easier for people to use? Operator tools. We have a bunch ourselves, but how do we start to share those in a way that's more meaningful, that are, intuitive? And I think that's a huge part of it, is everyone's built their own tool sets, and how do we make those intuitive, and maybe decide to open source them or standardize them in some way.
Yeah, and kind of add to what Phil was saying, I think on a broader perspective, bringing departments closer together as part of the virtual production process has been going a lot smoother. I think the first few years, everyone had a different experience on a different stage, using different formats of things, different color spaces. So everyone had these very varied experiences with virtual production. So I think going into this year and the next few years, looking at making that process smoother, taking all the experience everyone has had, making it a little bit smoother all the way from when you're evaluating a script and trying to assess what's going to be good for virtual production to actually creating that content. We've seen a lot of tools that are really promising coming up to create content, which I think has been a big gap in virtual production, since there was such an emphasis on what the hardware can do the first few years, and getting that kind of popped up different places. So now we're kind of moving towards not just popping it up and throwing something on the wall, but really making sure that process is super smooth from the production departments to the on-set folks to post.
I think I'm going to take this a little different direction, and it's really accessibility, adoption, and economics, because a lot of what's been happening is there's an economic barrier to entry, which means a lot of people can't even get into it. And so what we've focused on is being able to build them faster and get to shooting in a quicker amount of time, where you're not always going into a massive LED volume. And that seems to be working for us pretty well.
So something that's kind of a predecessor to LED volume virtual production is, you put a big green screen up. And we saw some examples here at the Virtual Production Summit. Green screens kind of work, and you can put any background you want there in a relatively, repeatable way, but, either live on set or after the fact. Is that one of the technologies you think that, I don't know, maybe is worth looking at to try to make virtual production more economical? Is like, don't worry about the panels, just put green up there and maybe show people what they're supposed to think they're seeing on their iPhone before they act the scene?
Well, I also think that green screen, blue screen, you always have to look at the project of what's the right tool for the job, right? And so I'd never say anywhere that we would that LED volumes are going to replace the use of a green screen, because that's just wrong. So, but absolutely being able to previs or tech viz and those sort of things in that space would be great. What we see more is, especially from the larger features, is the economic barrier being the cost of standing up an LED volume. And I think probably for some of us on the panel here that have volumes stood up, just the cost of maintaining them, and when it's not shooting, it still costs you money, right? And also being able to take the technology into new markets. You're talking, commercial agency type work. And where I'm going there is it's the adoption, but the adoption also requires flexibility and to be nimble. So I think for maybe some of the team on the up here, having libraries that are already optimized that could be repurposed or retextured to be used across an platform or a resource to go get them without everything having to be a custom build every time, because that in itself, the LED is one thing, that's one cost, but just the prep time and the creation of the content, and then somebody changed the script and then you have to do it again, and we see that all the time, right? And in some point, you run out of time, but the expectations don't change, and the economics certainly don't change, do they? So
I also think working on green or blue is kind of the known entity. So when you're talking to VFX soups or productions who are thinking about using virtual production, there's always a question of like, is this going to pay off? Like any new technology that you're using is going to feel risky. If you don't have experience with it or have minimal or bad experience with it, it feels a little bit like a risk. So I think adding some green and blue capabilities into virtual production workflows has been really important to help those productions who are used to, okay, today got out of hand, super complicated, we just need to throw blue, throw green. That really helps things run smoothly when they need to. Obviously, you know, if you have your script and visuals 100% locked in ahead of time, that's like the blue sky. But we all know that's not always the case. It's not usually the case. So it is important to have those flexibilities built in. And it also makes these workflows available to more types of productions. Like when you're looking at a script, it's like, well, we have a lot of CG characters, so we're gonna have to do this all in post anyway. If you're able to add effective green and blue solutions, even to just a portion of what you're shooting, that's immensely helpful, and you can still get your reflections and your backgrounds for the rest of the show.
Just using the camera frustum, putting that green or blue. Do you also
Right.
sometimes even limit it to even less of the frustum?
Yeah, absolutely. You can, you know, track objects and have that, you know, move along with your talent, with your actors, wherever you need, quite efficiently.
I've got a bit of a maybe contrarian view. I don't know if it's contrarian's the right term. I agree with everything that's been said, but I think if I'm looking to combine your first and second question, I think I looked at 5 years from now, I think we're going to be using really high quality lighting emitters that are just off camera to give us really nice skin tone, and we're going to be using machine learning on set to replace the backgrounds, right? Whether we're in front of LED or we're in a warehouse and we need to be in a forest, in my mind, we end up in real-time digital relighting, real-time background replacement, and we don't need the green. We don't, you know, as soon as frame segmentation is farther along and real-time rendering is available in a way that is, I think, at the quality that we're all used to from a visual effects point of view, I don't think we need any of this stuff. And then we solve the economic problem because, unfortunately, for some of us who own a lot of LED, we like don't need the LED anymore. We need different types of LED, and we have to adapt our inventories. And I think the safety net problem almost goes away, right? Because the safety net is you can be anywhere doing anything. And I think that, to me, is where we're headed. I think I very much agree with the safety net approach of, like, when we go into a production, right, saying, oh, we can still put green up. Like, we're not stopping you from doing anything that traditional visual effects can do. And so, like, don't be afraid of the tech. It shouldn't be in your way. And if we need to go to, I don't want to say the old way, but a more traditional way, we can do that without being an obstacle to production.
I think what's interesting is like there's a pendulum swing that happens, right? Everybody wants to use the new toys, and you end up really working way harder than you used to work in the past to get maybe sometimes an increment of a result that isn't that great. I think green screen and blue screen are having a comeback only because we're coming back into balance, and we're figuring out that while we're on set and we have to meet our day, it's a lot easier for us sometimes to just go back to a traditional method. And back to your innovations in what's happening, there are now lighting panels. I got a chance to use some on the last show that I did that are essentially a really high quality LED panel. This particular panel we used was from KinoFlow. It's called a Mimic. And you can pump picture data into it and use that to illuminate your subjects on set. So that helps sort of take the edge off or the curse off of the problem that you run into with a traditional green screen comp. Now, obviously, you've done a lot of work in the world of relighting people, and that has inspired some of these lighting companies to think really hard about how to use imagery to light fixtures themselves. And I think that's kind of a new innovation that we're going to see more of.
Very cool. Josh, any more to add?
Yeah, I mean, so first off, I, for one, hope I never have to spend 8 hours on another green screen set. It's just the least inspiring thing. And then when you leave, the world looks magenta and you feel a little bit off for a while. So I'm very happy to do away with it. And of course, somewhat biased because we are very active in camera visual effects and own a number of LED volumes. I think the economics of it is a very important question, but to me, I always want to bring it back to what gives you the better end result. and staring into a sea of green and imagining what potentially could be, and then making that decision 6 months after when the vast majority of your creative stakeholders have potentially are on another show entirely. And then you're now making creative decisions in a blackened studio, also with our visual effects artist, which is somewhat self-serving as well. But to me, it just feels like the right place to be making creative decisions, the right place to be making movie magic is on set, getting everyone collaborating together and being able to see that final result in camera. I mean, that's truly what I think will inspire more filmmakers. And then, I mean, just to kind of double back on that regarding the economics of it, rotoscoping and rotomation, Phil, what you're implying, like, especially with the innovation that we're getting with segmentation, there really won't be that big of a difference between performing segmentation on removing an LED screen versus removing a green screen. And just like with a green screen, you have green or blue spill, so equally odd lighting and cast on the talents. So I think both kind of have their own set of challenges, and it really just comes down to what it is the filmmaker is trying to accomplish. This is just another tool in the toolbox.
What are some of the things that feel like they're like the biggest pain points that we're still dealing with in virtual production? A couple of people have mentioned some things, and we're starting to get some solutions too. Are there any other particular pain points that keep it from being like the go-to solution for a greater number of kinds of shots?
Yeah, sure. I still, and I think Fred touched on this a little bit, the speed at creating content that is believable, photorealistic, usable on a number of environments, I think is probably the biggest hurdle, right? Like, cost is a hurdle. Cost is a hurdle no matter what you're doing in production, right? Like, and not to diminish it by any means, right? But like, it's a hurdle that I think is, and to your point about pop-ups, Fred, I think, like, solutions that can be deployed quickly and faster, and you guys are experts at it, I think is a way to help solve part of the economic challenge, but the environmental challenge is also time-based, right? And like, how do you iterate and how do you do it in a meaningful way that allows the people to tell stories together in a collaborative way?
I appreciate that, because just building it faster is only one piece to the time puzzle, right? And if you can chip away at a little bit of this at a time, but the problem is productions take too long to make decisions, and scripts get changed all the time. And if you started working on a piece of content and then it changed drastically, you just toss it and you start over, right? But what happens is you get compressed in time, but the delivery date is still the same and the economics are the same. So when you get pressed in time and you have to put more people on the project, you're not necessarily going to regain that financially back. So that is still and will be a problem. And I think education and adoption and uses, the more people use it and the more productions use it and they get familiar with the process, then this will start to plane out. But I still think we have a few years ahead of us as that starts to mellow.
Yeah, and solutions for content like generative AI and NERFs, we just had a really cool panel on, are very promising, but we also have to remember that a lot of things have to be very art directed, especially for film production or TV, but it is super promising to have some workflows down the pipe that we can kind of shorten that timeline, because you're right, even if you have all the money in the world, if you only have 2 weeks and you need to shoot something very ambitious, somehow you need to shoot on something for an LED volume. So those workflows are going to become very important, or folks who are investing in content libraries, things like that. We've been working with Disney Television, who's done a great job in bringing this technology to TV pipelines, which has been a challenge just because they are so short turnaround. They'll want to shoot something, again, like in 10 days, we have to shoot this one scene, and they don't want to, it's not enough time in front of an LED volume to warrant a full pop-up. So they're looking to book into somewhere just for 1 day of shooting. So how do we make that easier for production to greenlight that is one of the big challenges.
Yeah, traditionally, I said this, I think, in another talk yesterday. These two worlds are the world of in-camera, VFX and So it comes from VFX, right? Visual effects. Visual effects are slow and tedious. It's a slow and tedious process. Production is fast and furious. And to Christina's point, when you merge those two worlds together, some of the innovations that are really helping are just learning how those two worlds live together, because traditionally speaking, they're kept apart. So because when you're on set, you have to make your day. You've got X number of shots. It's got to happen. The economics, the amount of money you're spending on that single day is fairly high. So we're trying to figure out, and some of the innovations are little things that you wouldn't really think are incredible, but make those two worlds function much better together. Those are the types of things that are really going to help improve the industry and help make it a lot easier for people to be able to do these types of productions.
So this really does come up in a lot of cases, that getting the environments that are going to go on to the volume ready in time for the actors to show up and really shoot the scenes is a big challenge. And that previously for visual effects where it's done in post, it's fine if those take 30 minutes to render in Arnold or V-Ray. And now you've got to render them 24 times per second, which is many orders of magnitude faster. And it's a different kind of process. And you still need it to look good. You want final in-camera pixels if possible. So I think sometimes productions, like folks who know what they're doing, they say, we need 3 months to get all of the stuff ready. And then the production doesn't give the time. And as a result, what happens? The things don't look the way that you want them to do on the day, and so you're doing some background replacements in the end, possibly. Is this situation improving? Is there a path to improving it? Is it a fundamental problem with virtual production that we just have to deal with for a bit?
I don't think it's a fundamental problem of virtual production. I think it's fundamental problem of the studios and the just green lighting the project, right? And having somebody write the PO so you can all move forward. And we always put forward a timeline that is realistic, and it just gets compressed. And then, look, a Ferrari in LA costs the same as a Ferrari in South America. So my analogy is, how do you do something, how do you deliver a product cheaper when it costs this, you know what I mean? When you know what the cost burden is. So I think it fundamentally needs to change, not at the studio side, because I would like to believe they're reaping the benefit, right, at the later date.
There's a lack of believability, right? Like I think as vendors and as providers, we say X is going to need to happen, and then for whatever reason, even though I think amongst the group here we've been doing this for longer than most, like X isn't believed for whatever reason, and I think it's the illusion of the large corporate machine that like X can somehow change because you can always throw more money at it later. And I think in a weird way, virtual production, but actually just production, right? Like it's something that like you can do that with. I'm just not sure you should, because like you don't necessarily get a better product. And I think to Josh's point, like it's about like it's the right tool for the right job and like get the right product out of it, right? Like we're all storytellers, and like storytelling requires proper planning, spending the right amount of money, and then executing on the thing you planned and the timeline that you talked about with the commitments that you agreed upon, right? Like if half of us showed up to work tomorrow and decided we were going to do something different, like we would all get fired, right? And like the idea that like the studio ecosystem and production ecosystem show up today and like, oh, yesterday it was green, today it's red, fine. But like when it's a building and tomorrow it's a flying spaceship, but we're expected to meet the same means, and then it trickles downhill, and there's this effect on all of us to deliver that same good in that same timeline, even though we've expressed it takes a certain amount of time, becomes really challenging. So I think it's a production problem, right? In many ways, has always sort of been my perspective on it.
Yeah, I think all of these new tools they help the timeline, but fundamentally it's a human issue of also the production pipeline being shaken up a bit by virtual production, which I think is one of the largest pain points for a lot of folks who want to go into it, is that like now you have to pull a bunch of folks who are going to be heavy in post over to pre-production. That means your art director might have to be involved in your production a lot earlier than you might have hired them anyway, or that they need to work with now a virtual art department, and what does that mean? there's a lot of
Fix it and prep.
yeah, fix it and prep. So there's a lot of things that are shaking up, and I think that's where kind of the risk factor comes in, where productions are like, wow, this is a lot more work now than it was for a known system. Though yes, it might yield a much better result or ultimately save them money. It's not necessarily the money at the end of the day that's stopping them, because it does save a lot in post.
It also forces a lot of creative people that are used to making decisions way down the line to make instant decisions. And that's sometimes difficult.
So in traditional filming, if you're going to build a big set in your studio, everyone seems to understand that takes time, and everyone also seems to understand that the carpenters and everyone need to be finished and have the time to finish before people show up and light it, and then you act on it. Is there just some kind of misunderstanding that like similar constraints apply in computer generated stuff too?
People hate change, right? Like,
It's hard.
And we also have to keep in mind the construction portion there is a great example, because if you go into the volume, part of that construction budget now needs to migrate over to the construction of that environment, and just that little hurdle right there, which isn't really too hard to understand, is a really big thing to try to get certain teams to understand that you're taking from this bucket and you're putting it in that bucket, but it still requires the same amount of time.
Yeah, one of the things I found has been really successful is pairing up some of the episodic and film, what I'll call traditional post VFX line producers, UPMs, EPs, with we do a lot of live broadcasts with live broadcast producers, right? Because like live broadcast, it always has happened on the front end, right? And although it's not the same narrative, same creative, same, right? But it's the same process and it's similar budgets, and they actually also engage visual effects houses and motion graphics houses, and like often are building environments. And sometimes allowing those people to talk as peers removes the onus of the vendor, right? In some cases where like I come in and go, oh, we've got to move this, this hurdle that like shouldn't be that hard. Like it's very easy, I feel like, to understand. Becomes something that there's a resistance to it because people don't like change and it's new and it's hard. And I think I paired up a handful of producers on two different sides of that aisle and come back with they both have learned something, and it seems like that has helped get through that hurdle quite a little bit. It's not perfect, but it helps.
From a perspective of what you were saying about getting these, we're used to rendering fairly high-end images, and then we have to translate this to a real-time engine. And that engine is both incredible and totally frustrating at the same time. The things that you can get out of these real-time engines are incredible, but you're so frustrated because you're used to a certain level of quality, and now you're having to jam what took an hour and a half to render into 24 frames per second. That's an order of magnitude that is, I can't do the math in my head right now, but the problem is you're looking for cheats, right? And we've been doing this in visual effects for a long time. As lighting was progressing and rendering, we've been trying to cheat, lighting, cheat the way, trying to mimic reality. We're trying to do that now with these. And the problem is that they're just, I think Phil and I were talking about this, there's not, the subset of people that can do this right is very, very small. And so you're not only talking about people that know how to make environments in a DCC package, but can then optimize those to run at a high frame rate and still look believable to the eye. And again, one of the problems that a lot of creatives will walk into a volume and go, oh my God, what am I looking at? And we always have to remind them, please look through the camera. Don't just look at what you see here, look through the camera, because this is all a magic trick, all of it, the whole thing. And keep that in mind.
Yeah, I've been using the analogy of like you wouldn't walk onto a stop motion set and like look at the things and go, oh, that doesn't look good, right? Like you like gotta look through the camera and like it turns into a beautiful thing, and like you've got to respect that to some degree.
Yeah, there's a difference between like when we say in-camera visual effect, that doesn't actually mean right in front of you visual effect, right? It's like from a particular perspective and maybe with some processing and such on there.
And largely what we're doing is extending the real world. And if you've ever been on a real film set, it kind of looks a little boring sometimes. The real world is boring. And it's not until you point a camera at something and you light it properly that it becomes a movie. And all of these things need to come together in perfect harmony to make a good shot. So yeah, I think it's natural to feel that way when you first walk onto a stage, especially when you treat it as a big TV. I mean, you're almost viewing it as like, well, this is what my final product should look like, and not really the case. I think largely a lot of this comes down to a misconception of what these tools can do for creatives. I mean, yes, visual effects is a very time-consuming process. It's a complicated process, but so is the creative process. And using real-time technology, I mean, it's in the name. It's real time. It can be a creative tool that allows your filmmakers to reach and find out ultimately what they want to be doing almost instantaneously. I mean, traditionally with the pre-production pipeline, we have many months of previs, and the iteration on that previs used to be weeks at a time before you could then see that what that shot could look like before giving notes. So I think if you find the efficiencies there, and you give a production designer, a director, a showrunner 4 months to come up with an environment, but in parallel, you're constantly iterating and building on that environment within a real-time workflow, then I mean, it's actually quite simple to deliver exactly what you want on the data principle of photography.
Awesome. So in the green screen shoots, you don't have something that you can literally see in front of you that looks like the final product. The actual light arriving at the camera isn't the final product, but what you put on the monitor, if you do a live composite, can be close to the final product or give you a very good sense of that. The actors can see that, the director can see it, the DP can see it, everyone's going to want to look at the monitors. And even on traditional film sets, it's all about, hey, can we go look at the monitor and see what we're really doing? Where does it really make a big difference to have more than that, to have, the explicit LED panels on there? I could imagine like for, an eyeline in a shot, someone had a great example yesterday about like, putting a scary creature and you have to get a sense of like where and how scary it is, how you should react to it and such. But as we know, a lot of actors, start in live theater and they just see an audience out there and a few lights and they have to imagine everything and you get great performances. A lot of times in a virtual production stage, the whole front of the stage is open. And that's where the actors are looking into. And they don't really see any of the panels when they're actually performing. They see it when they walk onto stage, which is nice to get into the mood for that. How important is this really?
In the past, when using Eyeline, we use projection, right? And so Jungle Book was an awful lot of projection, but it was an awful lot of LED off camera, doing interactive lighting, and of course using proxy files that were going to be used in compositing and post, but mainly we use projection on Eyeline type of work.
And that works fine, apparently.
It's cost effective and it's a very large image, but if it is truly Eyeline and it's something for somebody to look at and talk back and forth with, in this case, Mowgli's talking to Bagheera, and it worked perfectly great for that. And you could move it, the projector rather simply, based on his field of view.
I feel like a lot of the raving reviews of virtual production have come from talent on a show who are just, they're used to being in kind of a sterile green screen environment. So when you're able to actually step into a space and see the mountainscape around you or the sunset or be in the desert or whatever it is, it does seem to drastically change like how you feel in that space. Even if you're just crew and you walk on and, there's a bunch of ice, you're like, I'm cold now. So I think a lot of the times for talent, it is really helpful to have that environment besides all the technical advantages, the lighting. And,
I remember a quote from Werner Herzog himself from first season of Mandalorian, raving about it, and he's not an easily impressed person.
Do you remember that?
I do actually.
He was pretty upset about the audio inside of there.
He was, that's true.
Sound.
But he did like the inside of was it the warehouse? Not the warehouse, but the office area was I think. So one of the things that I feel like we've done a lot of is process work. And one of the challenges with both traditional process work on a trailer or even in front of green screen is not knowing when you might turn, when you might, when an action may need to happen. And so we use a lot of visual aids, off screen or off frame in gonna turn left in 3, 2, 1, and like also color code it, right? So the actors like learn that, oh, we're gonna turn left. And I think doing that also in large format virtual production, like, okay, here's the, you know, here's the talent, and then there's a animated character running towards them, right? I think is really helpful. At the end of the day, I think part of what works really well with virtual production is that I think it adds a qualitative, an intangible, undefinable qualitative value to the production. It looks better. People buy more tickets because it looks better, hopefully, right? Like at the end of the day, from a commercial perspective. But I also think that we get better performances out of talent, and that also drives ticket sales, believability, better story. And a lot of that, I think, is them being able to respond to their environment in a meaningful way. And I think hopefully that's what we're doing. We're trying to provide interactive, immersive environments for people who we want them to believe so that we believe when we watch it later on.
I think the opportunities for narrative moments as well are, the potential is greater with virtual production. There was a show had a woman walking up to the edge of a mountain view, and they were basically going to cut it. You know, she walks up, maybe they have one shot kind of insert of the view, and then the shot's over. But with virtual production, you're able to have her walk up that mountain, actually take in the view, and have that be, you know, a moment in the story that you can visually spend time on. That's not going to cost you a bunch of extra for background replacement seconds and things like that.
I think what's interesting about virtual production is also thinking about getting really good at combining the live action elements that are part of the set. It's so important to have things on set. And if you've ever been, I'm old enough to have, worked back in the day when we used to build models for actual models for visual effects, where you would glue stuff together and shoot it on a set. And virtual production is kind of similar to that. If you get the right set elements, and it really responds really well to light and reflection, and there's just nuances of lighting that you just can't get in a comp. It's things that compositors spend a lot of time trying to replicate after the fact. There's so many nuances that you get that you can get those magical moments where you get a little bloom or a little ping off the lens, and you just wouldn't be able to get that in reality.
So, Josh, please.
One of the things that excites me the most about virtual production is just this idea of emergence. Being in this interactive environment, getting everyone collaborating together allows for kind of happenstance. You get unique things that you may not have scripted. And we've seen that happen over and over again. And also I think this kind of pinpoints a critical issue in virtual production, or in the current state of virtual production right now, is the lack of interactivity that we have in these virtual worlds. They're still very much static. They're environments, and they need static environments, and they need to be that way because of optimization to hit that the target performance. And I mean, as we see compute improving, rendering techniques improving, I think that's going to open up more and more creative possibilities. And it's going to be more than just this in-camera backdrop, more than just an eyeline, more than just interactive lighting. It can be potentially just a completely unique creative storytelling tool that we wouldn't have been able to do otherwise.
Yeah, I think machine learning is going to play a lot into that, because as it helps us optimize rendering and make things faster for throwing smaller pixels at it, we're going to see a lot more of what Josh was just talking about.
Well, let me pick up on the lighting thread a little bit. A lot of virtual productions today use the panels for some of the lighting. That got mentioned yesterday in the Stagecraft presentation. It's like, hey, don't forget, it's also about the lighting. But also, most productions typically will also bring practical lighting elements on, and DPs will, get to the result that they want to have, hopefully, by kind of a combination of the panels and physical lights. And this has been a learning curve here. Have you seen that the way that you combine these to try to get the desired lighting sort of stabilized into, people kind of know what to do, there's best practices, or people just kind of figuring it out on the day a lot still? And have there been improvements to make it so that maybe the stage itself is a bit better at doing the lighting?
Well, the first thing is the LED volume isn't going to create sunlight or cast shadows. So you have to build these volumes with production functionality, which means you're able to remove panels, not only for stunts or for lighting or special effects, but be able to move, change, remove panels so you can put a lighting fixture to have the sun cast from the east, for example. So that's one thing an LED volume's never going to do, is be a kookalorus, right? So using the LED and the volume and as interactive lighting as well as your in-camera capture is something that's been going on for 20 years or so, I would say. So, but to the earlier point that KinoFlow has come out with the Mimic, and they're just taking an old idea and making it better, right? And it's come a long ways, right?
I think we know now that there was like a misconception that you didn't need lights at first, right? Oh, that it's gonna you really, especially when you're trying to drive the sun, as Fred pointed out, you need to be able to put a pretty heavy duty fixture to at least get that part. All of the indirect lighting though is the beauty of the volume. So that indirect lighting, the things that you're still going to want to do some shaping. Of course, you're still going to want negative fill and floppies and all of that stuff. But what's really important is that some of the things that you wouldn't get, you now get, which is all of the indirect lighting.
There's also tools now to integrate practical lights with the LED volume content. So that's also really helpful if you have your practical lights up there and they're doing movement and your content needs to also mimic that. And that's relatively recent before you could do that, but somewhat manually.
Josh?
Yeah, just to echo everyone else, I mean, it's very diffuse lighting. It is your fill lighting, the lighting that's emitted from the LED screen. And to my earlier point, it is kind of boring. It's not yet a movie. It could be kind of real. I mean, obviously the spectral response of it is not daylight. It's something very weird, but it's still it's your fill lighting. So as a DP, you need a key light if you want it to be a drama. And so I mean, that process hasn't really changed. From a compositing perspective, even the low quality RGB lighting does make a big difference in compositing. I think certainly as we start to see improvements from a lighting perspective in LED hardware, that will get us much more closer to reality and might make the blending process, make the believability, making the marriage between the physical set and the virtual world a lot more seamless. And also potentially improve the in-camera response as well. I mean, cameras are used to seeing full spectrum lighting. And in a certain way, it makes sense to pair an RGB LED with an RGB camera, but the cameras weren't designed to do that either. So I think overall, it should just improve the quality as we start to add more primaries to LED panels. And I know in the coming months, I'm sure we're gonna see a large number of products coming out that are RGBW, RGBWW, as well as improved in-camera performance for traditional RGB panels. So I think it's a really exciting time from a hardware perspective and for lighting.
Yeah, so going to NAB this year, it was exciting to see, I think, 3 different manufacturers I saw that had an RGBW or WW panel, which was great. And at some point, it seemed like it might be a difficult sell to get people to put the white LED in because it's a somewhat different kind of LED. It's got a phosphor to convert the rest of the broad spectrum wavelengths. And it also will do absolutely nothing to increase the color gamut of your panel. It will produce something that is right in the middle of your existing gamut. So it arguably doesn't even need to be there, but in fact, it makes a huge difference about how it lights things. Now, these are just coming on the market, and there's actually lots of great virtual production going on without him at this point. What are some strategies you've seen to mitigate the problem that the lighting that comes off of the panels tends to make people look, too pinkish, too reddish, and shifts colors on costumes and such?
Filtration makes a big difference, as well as lighting. So lighting is lighting. Even if it was realistic, we're not going for realistic. Most cinematographers will tell you, I don't care what it looks like in the real world. I'm going to motivate these lights, but I'm also telling a story. So light's part of the story. And they're shaping light, and they're creating darkness in places to assist the storytelling. So that additional lighting or shaping or using negative fill, things that will cut off the light from the foreground subject. Those are tools that you can use, as well as filtration packs inside of the lenses themselves. And all of that in concert with each other works very well to help mitigate some of those problems.
I think really understanding, and I agree, but I think also really understanding the off-axis color shift of your individual product and its response to the camera and the ability to shade it as the camera moves, I think is important. Although the shading as the camera moves will only solve a number of problems, so you still may have physical obstruction. At the end of the day, understanding that like a a particular tile tints from, let's call it rust to aqua, right? If or brown to a blue, right? Knowing what angle it is in relation to your hero talent and having that flexibility to maybe move it or move the talent so that you're not getting that cast. Although not completely solves the issue, but it helps. And I think. Also, the lighting industry needs to fundamentally change. Is a big, probably in relation more to your previous question, but also I think with this as well with the RGBWW and every lighting manufacturer makes a product that has some number of diodes in it. Some are, red, green, blue, magenta, lime, warm white, cool white, and teal, right? And when we talk about what that looks like on human skin, we may on a meter read a very specific thing, but it doesn't look good, right? And how do we actually get to a place where everyone is talking about the same thing and working in the same color space, or at least a working space intermediary, right, in some fashion? And I think that to me is the thing that we need to get to, and that's what the strategy should be about. It should be, how do we have a conversation not just about the LED walls, important to fix, right? But at the end of the day, you still need lighting, right? Yes. And so, so how do we fix this issue, right? And that's the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you, Eric. Yes.
And time to pre-light, because now they want
to get it right.
Days.
One of the use cases for virtual production that's come up is using it for reshoots, and the idea that because of a change in the story, or you didn't have as many days on location as you had hoped, you might have to go and add some other scenes that'll intercut with stuff that was actually shot on a location, and you just want to shoot it on your LED volume. How do you set that process up for success?
I know what I've been doing. I've been making production designers bring the sets that were outside into the volume and looking at them under the light and going, I had an example of tarmac. We were doing an aircraft show and they tarmac outside and they needed to build an airplane inside. And tarmac just doesn't look the same underneath the LED, right? And it's to the point about pre-light time. It's you need the time to bring those elements inside, look at them under the LED, look at them under the artificial lighting you're going to have, and maybe have a conversation about repainting them, right? Or toning them, or deal with posts so that you know that you can tint the entire thing in a certain way. And then you also have to back that into your practical lighting so that you tint it in the same way. And it's a challenging, but I think getting everyone on the same, I think you mentioned earlier, Christina, about getting people on the same page about departments, right? How do we bring them together and have that conversation? To me, that's a huge part of it. Let's stand here, look at it, agree it doesn't look good, and it's okay that it doesn't, but how are we going to solve that problem,
I think art department is a really big player in the virtual production process that's often overlooked by the initial inquirers of VP. So it's super important to have them involved, especially for something like reshoots or the next season, they want to reuse a set, things like that.
It's really important also to, when you're on set, capture really high quality plates. Plates, even though you can't move your camera around, or you can a little bit before you can see that it's just a flat plate. You can get an incredible amount done with just a moving background, and a
video background.
A video background, and nature is rendering it. It looks like it's supposed to. Many of the process shots that are done that way, and so you can get a lot of mileage out of plates. And while you're there shooting, it doesn't take all that much to shoot some plates when you're on location. So that's very important. And if you make production aware of that ahead of time and you capture the things that you need while you're there, oftentimes you can make something work inside of a volume very convincingly.
Yeah, the more material you capture on set, the more useful that is into post-production. I mean, Paul, you bring up a lot of potential really interesting use cases there where, I mean, we almost have an in-camera equivalent of ADR. We shoot something, let's say, on a physical location, and we need to redo a line. Obviously, we're not going to fully recreate that environment that was shot on location. So what can we capture on set that can then be reused to effectively relight and reshoot just that one individual insert? I think nerfs have a lot of potential to be potentially that solution. We just need to standardize and ensure that the capture is occurring correctly on set that can then be kind of seamlessly transitioned back into a reshoot using virtual production technology.
That's it. So getting high quality background plates, but then you're kind of fixed at that point. That would let you reshoot the shots that you anticipated you might need to reshoot from this angle. Doing a photogrammetry or a nerf on the set, like, is there any practical way that we could recommend just record every single set before you get off before you release the location? Is that
That's like a dream. That's our dream. Then you can build content libraries from that. I mean, think of these studios who have so many productions going at once. If they're able to get high quality content from each of those sets, that's a huge library right there. That's a potential source to train AIs and things like that. So that would be amazing. How that said, we know productions move at 1,000 miles a minute. So the organization of making sure that happens is actually can be quite difficult. If it's a big VFX show, you might already have someone from a VFX team who's taking reference data and things like that. That's a really easy, great opportunity to have a conversation with your VFX vendor about that. And if you don't, that could be as easy as hiring someone to do that reference on your set.
Do you feel like there's a budget constraint in there? Because it'll come down to budget in order to do that.
100%. And the thing is that, the amount of money it would take to really capture everything that you would need to do anything that you want is pretty trivial compared to the amount of money it would take to get everybody back together for a reshoot. So I think it's an economy of scale. It's getting executives to understand that this future proofs this. It's easier to do when you're on something episodic because they're thinking long term. But when you're on a feature, it's harder to get that mentality.
We actually find it's very often the opposite because on episodics, you're just struggling to get your day. But on the upside, you typically have multiple cameras. So you are capturing data. It's just that data exists. It's how we use that data that could potentially be used after the fact for a reshoot. I think you're right. It needs to be a well-oiled machine, and there's very little time to insert some VFX nerds. I mean, Paul, we barely get time to send you in with a gray ball and a Macbeth chart. So it's always a struggle. So I think using what we're already capturing, there's a lot of work being done right now on monocular-based depth. And I think having multi-camera shoots does give us those perspectives. Witness cameras are something we use very frequently in virtual production shoots, and maybe that can be incorporated as well into traditional on-location shoots. I think there's a lot of ideas, and it's wide open for innovation.
Yeah, I agree with that. So we started using, actually a couple of years back now, we have a near real-time LiDAR system on one of our stages, and that's worked really well. So in about 2 seconds, we can scan a set. So we do it kind of while it's shooting, and now we're working on stitching it. But it only works in partnership with exactly that other stuff, right? Like we still need, and hopefully a monocular reference, right, that we can pair it up against so we can project the proper color and all that kind of stuff onto the sets. But like having the data we found was a minimal cost. It was how do we use the data in a meaningful way that everyone can digest it? Someone turns over a petabyte of raw files to you and you kind of go, well, okay, even the largest VFX houses, like, Pixo obviously has that capability, but like for most of us who maybe don't have that, it's incredibly difficult to parse through all that data, identify what's important, tag it, process it, turn it into something that's usable. And I do think that's where a lot of innovation will come from is the ease of use of this data. And I think, you asked about innovation earlier. It's that standardization. Is like what is a standard for that data that we're going to need moving forward? Because I think that's the only way we get to not have to bring the sets back every few weeks.
I think even outside of this very kind of complicated use case where you're on a location shoot and you're trying to fully recreate that with some level of accuracy for a reshoot, just looking at a standard virtual production, it's a very controlled environment with lots of technology and lots of data capture, but even still, that data doesn't necessarily always travel correctly back into post-production. That's very much a challenge that we're facing now. So I think addressing that may pave the way for future innovation in taking these same techniques, these same post-production techniques or reshooting techniques to traditional filmmaking.
You've been there, and I know you've been there, where you're on set and you're capturing a bunch of information, and there's a bunch of metadata and things coming off of the camera, and then when you get to post, because you're there on set in a VFX capacity, you get to post and they don't have the information you know was there on set. That happens so many more times than not. I used to keep my own records and used to copy everything from the camera cart just so that when I got to post, when I was supervising, that I would know where the information was, because it does fall between chairs, even today.
I remember my first kind of foray into visual effects, I was shocked at the fact that cameras capture so much metadata, but what gets delivered to a visual effects company is an image sequence with no metadata. I mean, it's gradually changing, but it's just bizarre to me. I really don't know. I mean, the data exists, it's there, it needs to make it through the pipe. But visual effects studios have also gotten really good at figuring things out without that data, so they've kind of solved the problem, kind of in their own way. But no, I think it really just comes down to better communication. One of the added benefits of virtual production is you get a lot of visual effects collaborating live on set. So I think we're potentially in a better position to not only capture, but retain and then deliver that data off to vendors after.
So we've got about 10 minutes left, so I'd like to get some audience questions at some point. If anyone immediately has one, I think we've got one over here, yeah? And there.
Hi. So you were talking about blue screen versus in camera, and I'm wondering, I know people are working on trying to capture as much matting data as possible to give you the option of going back and fixing it. And I'd like to hear people speak about the possibility of doing like a hybrid approach, where maybe you've got a lower res background for purposes of interactive and performance, but you go back and put a better background in on a pass in post.
Actually, Paul, you have something you're publishing for SIGGRAPH or DigiPro that's incredibly fascinating and kind of potentially addresses this topic. I don't know if you want to self-promote a little bit, but
so I'll give a talk at I think it's like around 4 o'clock today, right here, and it's a compositing technique that will hopefully get like good training data for figuring out ground truth alpha channels, maybe better than the algorithms that are out there. And if you want to be weird for a bit, you can use it directly as well. So I'll talk about the magenta green screen technique in a bit. But yeah,
there are some things that are happening now where we're trying techniques that are older techniques, and Matt, you will recognize these techniques, where you increase the frame rate of the camera, and then you start flickering the imagery that you're seeing. So you get the benefit of a green screen on frame 1, and frame 2 is a lit composite with what's coming from the background. And by altering those things and pulling those apart and using some clever optical flow, you can end up with a beautiful matte and a really nicely lit image. Except for the problem is that you have to stay in a volume where all that's flickering and not have a seizure. That's the key to that whole thing.
But it's only a time problem, right? Like we talk about this, I think, in this weird way, like it's a new thing, and I'm guilty of this as well. I'm not calling you out by any means. If any of you have ever watched baseball, anything with the digital billboard, digital signage does this currently on TV. They run about 240 frames a second. There's 4 slices at 60 frames a second, so they can localize advertising down to individual demographics. And many of you have been in different.
So if you phase shift your camera shutter,
exactly,
it shows different ads.
Yeah, and effectively at you've been to stadiums and you don't see the flicker right in the stadium, right? And so it's a time problem. We have to get faster. The resolutions we work with are far greater than the broadcast resolution, so we have to process that data faster. I think there's other opportunities here, right? It's not just in the how do we get a clean matte. It's in how do we now automate the process of what were we looking at, render out a much higher quality, even offline render of it, and streamline that in delivery so that when an editor opens it up and you bring your files to post, they've got what was shot, they've got the map, but then they also automatically have been delivered the higher resolution comp, right, in the infill or whatever it's going to be, so that you're right away editing what you need. I think that's where there's tons of room for innovation.
Very good. Thank you for that. And let's see here. I think we've got a question over here.
Hi guys. So I work at a movie studio, and I know you got. I'm gonna go back to earlier what you were talking about. It's a process getting a movie to lock, right? And we're getting people to adopt virtual production on the studio side is also a challenge, which is part of what I do for a living. Is trying to get people to think in that way. So I know there are things like Ghost Frame that exist. Can you talk about any other tools, if they do exist, that kind of give folks some flexibility as you go to the process of getting a movie to lock?
Do ghosts exist?
Yes, they do.
Okay.
What a really nice thing about what happens on a virtual production set that doesn't normally happen on a normal set is you get all kinds of information that are really good for visual effects. You get very precise camera tracking information. Oftentimes, that's one of the first things you do. You pull in a shot, you rotoscope things, you're tracking camera information, you're match moving things. A lot of that information is happening simultaneously on set. So you're getting that information as you're shooting, and it's making utilization of that downstream that is really good. And telling people about it, I think, is important so that they understand you're 80% of the way there, especially on VFX heavy films.
Although that is a slippery slope, though. I mean, I think many studios now believe that because we're tracking the camera, well, they don't really match move. There's a lot, they can cut out the vast majority of visual effects because, hey, we've captured all this data. But again, that brings us back to relaying that data in a meaningful way that can be ingested by a visual effects company that does streamline the process. And right now, that's not really there. Our requirements for in-camera visual effects are vastly different than what a compositor might need. And so there's a big discrepancy there. And again, I think that's definitely a wide open area for a lot of innovation.
I would kind of encourage maybe a different angle, which is like, it's not about what tools can you do to mitigate the risk. While that's important, like nothing is stopping you from using a volume and still doing what you're used to doing. Like you can still match move in many cases on an LED volume. You can still roto an LED volume. You can still digitally relight the talent on LED volume. Like there's no, like the risk is only because we are afraid of using new tools, not because the tool stops us from doing the things that we are comfortable with doing. And I think that's the conversation the studio should be having. And I realize it's an uphill battle, but like to me, that's the narrative is like, I'm not preventing anyone who walks into any of our stages or deploys a process stage from, oh, you can't roto this, or oh, you can't change this in post. No, like do whatever you want. We're not stopping you, but hopefully you, if you can commit, you get a better looking result when you walk away, right? To me, that's the narrative.
If you're educating at the studio level, I definitely advise making sure your creatives get on a volume and get some like playtime hands-on, kind of helps them, because anyone who's creative, they're thinking about different tools they can use and how to use them. So once they usually get their hands on things, it's like, oh, okay, I get it now. I get how I can do this and I can't do that. And that's extraordinarily helpful for things being productive on a day of shooting.
I also think bringing it back to something that they're familiar with. I mean, drawing direct comparisons and situations that they might have already run into. Like, I mean, for instance, let's say you have an on-location shoot at a historical site with a very large lot of background talent and an A-list actor. A lot can go wrong in that situation. And I mean, if anything, this is actually a much more significantly controlled environment than you could ever get out in the real world. So it's, yeah, I think drawing those comparisons actually might help your case and might make it much more accessible.
Oh, all right. I think we're gonna have time for probably just one more question, but who's the lucky person?
I win by proximity. Amazing panel. Paul's research, the Magenta research, is going to create some killer ground truth for these segmentation algorithms, right? Phil, you alluded to real-time segmentation. I mean, Josh, you were talking about witness cameras and monocular depth estimation. I know this is virtual production in 2023, but could some of y'all paint a vignette for what the future of virtual production looks like?
Who's going to go first? Okay. Yeah. Excellent question. Tough question. I think I have said this before, so forgive me for rehashing stuff on a panel, but I firmly believe like we're just at the stage right now where we can make it work. We've just kind of figured it out. All the pieces have come together and we can reliably get good looking shots. I mean, a lot of our shows now are kind of like 90% finaled in camera on the shots that we intend to be finaled in camera. So we're getting pretty close, but that last 10% is often the most challenging. And now really what we're trying to do here is fully mimic the real world. And there are so many subtleties and so much that needs to happen, both on the rendering side, both on the camera tracking side, to truly make that believable. I think one thing that I've kind of dug into quite a bit now is how can we make this data translate seamlessly into post-production? And then, very much largely, a lot of the techniques that we've discussed will make, mitigate the risk that is often associated with virtual production. The big risk being that, well, you front-loaded your visual effects. So when things go wrong, and things always go wrong on film shoots, it may be a more expensive mistake now. But more often than not, what we see, the mistake actually has nothing to do with virtual production. It's just filmmaking, stuff goes wrong. So I certainly see the use case there for a lot of these technologies to completely remove that risk and still give us what we need to easily re-render and fix things more readily in post.
I think as the technology for rendering improves, and the real-time tools improve, and the depth estimation tools improve, we're going to see a lot more people using it for lower. There's like a mid segment. There's like the lower end productions, the mid segment of productions, and then the high end. The mid segment is going to start using it more. The lower guys are always going to try, the new stuff. And when you're doing it at the different levels, I think the democratization of it is going to help, because people are going to be able to get their hands on these tools and play around. It's then going to become more commonplace, and you're going to see a lot more adoption just because it's easier for them to wrap their heads around it.
Yeah, it's a great question. I believe that we get to a place where everything is happening in situ, in real time, on set. So we're generating the particle sims we need. We're creating physics responsive water simulations based on what the camera is seeing. And I think we do that in the next 5 years, right? And to me, that's why I talk about the green screen and the LED going away, is because I think that at that point, really all we need is the eyeline and the idea that we're going to have some maybe high quality skin tone lighting. And everything else is done there. Like, we as storytellers make decisions, and there will be VFX. Like, I don't think that's going anywhere necessarily, because people want to change their minds later. But I think instead of walking away with the idea that we capture something in a volume and it's almost good enough, or it is good enough in many cases, everything we capture, no matter where we are, is good enough no matter what we want it to be. And that is, I think, both the accessibility problem, right? Everyone should be able to use that technique and those technologies, as well as, I think, expanding into an area that I think is largely untouched, which is super stylized workflows, right? Like, we have not seen any of this, or I have not anyways. A couple here and there, but like, actually, I saw one the other day in a student project. It was really interesting. But like the use of comic book style, right? And like doing it in real time, being able to tweak the depth of the lines as we draw them in real time and walk away at the end of the day, and that's what goes to the DIT. I think it's like really, really fascinating opportunity for telling new stories in a way that we, I think, can't even fathom yet.
Yeah, more advanced real-time composites, kind of simulcam style, and more complex environments that can be generated quickly that can plug into those workflows, I think would be a really cool place to be.
I think everybody's pretty much nailed it, but at the end of the day, it's all at the studio level. It's going to be about economics, and I just think over time that as time compresses, hopefully budgetarily, or as time goes on and budgetarily, budgets start to realize the advantage of this, and that they open this up a bit more to filmmakers in all different markets, at the top tier and the mid. And that also what we also see right now is skills gap, because with any emerging technology, we have a skills gap, but it's rapidly, I don't know to say catching up, but I think in a few years, to your point, that there's going to be a lot more people educated in this process, and that it's going to be more accessible.
Very cool. Well, I think that that'll be a great sign of this technology maturing, where it becomes kind of the more standard go-to technique for any level of production. And maybe it's only like when you get that extra budget that you actually really do go to a location. Just like right now, the highest end film that's out there right now is the one that was actually shot on film, and everybody else is shooting digital at this point, and we'll get that inversion. But I'd like to thank all of our panelists, Josh, Eric, Phil, Christina, and Fred. Thank you very much for a great panel. And I think it's time for lunch.
Yeah, time for lunch, everyone.